Turn to the book of Genesis chapter 42. Now, as I said last week, I'm trying to speed things up a little bit. In fact, my goal is to finish the book of Genesis by the end of the year. And in order to do that, I've got to cover at least one chapter a week. So to speed things up, I'm actually going to go through this chapter and all the rest of the chapters paragraph by paragraph rather than verse by verse. So if you notice that we've picked up the speed a little bit, it's because I see the finish line and I'm ready to finish. Anyways, look with me if you would in verses 1 and 2. When Jacob heard that grain was available in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why are you standing around looking at one another? I have heard there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy enough grain to keep us alive. Otherwise, we're all going to die." Now, according to Genesis chapter 41, verse number 57, what we looked at last week, people from all over the Middle East were traveling to Egypt in order to buy grain. And the reason they were doing that is because the 7-year famine that Joseph had predicted had already begun. If you remember, God had warned Pharaoh in a dream that there would be 7 years of prosperity, 7 years of bumper crops, in which they would harvest more grain than they could consume. But after the 7 years of prosperity, 7 years of drought would come, producing a great famine. Not just in Egypt, but in all of the Middle East and also northern Africa. Now, when Pharaoh had this dream, he didn't know what it meant. All he knew is that it was a spiritual dream. In other words, it contained a prophetic message from God. So he called for all of his magicians, and he called for all of his wise men, and wise men, plural, and he told them about the dream, and he wanted them to be able to interpret it, but they couldn't. So the cupbearer took him aside, and I'm kind of reading into this, but he took him aside, and he told him about a man that he met in prison, who, when he had a dream, interpreted his dream, and everything that he said came to pass just like he said that it would. So Pharaoh called for Joseph, and he's the one who interpreted Pharaoh's dream. He's the one that warned Pharaoh that there would be 7 years of prosperity, 7 years of bumper crops, followed by 7 years of drought that would cause a great famine throughout the known world, throughout the Middle East, and all of northern Africa. Now, if you remember, Joseph also counseled Pharaoh on how to prepare for this future famine. And because he gave such wise counsel, Pharaoh decided to put him in charge over everything in Egypt. He became the vizier, or maybe you've heard it pronounced the vizier, but I'm going to pronounce it vizier. And that's how Joseph became the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. Now, when the famine struck, just as Joseph said it would, the word got out that Egypt had grain for sale. So people from all over the Middle East were traveling to Egypt in caravans to buy grain. And that's how Jacob heard that there was grain for sale in Egypt. Now, I love what he said to his sons. Look at the last part of verse number 1 again. When Jacob heard that grain was available in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why are you standing around looking at each other?" You see, whenever we don't know what to do, whenever we're faced with the problem and we have no idea what the solution is, what do? We look to others for answers. Think about it. Have you ever been in a group before and you were looking for an answer? I mean, there's this common problem, and so you don't know what to do. Well, what do you do when you have a group of people doing that? Well, you start looking at each other. People is human nature. You'll look directly at someone and you don't even have to say anything. They automatically know that by looking at them, you're asking, well, what would you do? How many of you ever been on, maybe you're bored, or maybe you just got together and you're trying to fix this problem, so you talk about the problem, and all of a sudden the person who is talking stops and he looks directly at you. Now, he doesn't have to say anything. When he looks directly at you, you know what he's doing. He's asking, what would you do in this situation? And so that's what they were doing. And what do we do when people do that to us? We say, don't look at me. How many of you ever done that? You know, you're talking about something and they look at you and you make eye contact, you realize, oh, they expect an answer. And so you say, don't look at me. In other words, I don't know what to do. And that's what was happening. You know, they were talking about the famine and they were looking at their supply and they saw it dwindling down and they realized, well, we have all of these flocks, but we don't have any grain. What are we going to do? And so they're looking at each other, and everyone's going, well, don't look at me. I don't know what we're going to do. So Jacob's sons are doing that, and all of a sudden Jacob steps up and he says, hey, wait a minute. Stop looking at each other. I've got the answer. I've heard that there's grain in Egypt. You 10 boys need to get down there and buy the family some grain so we all won't die. Now, look at verses 3 through 5. So Joseph's 10 older brothers went down to Egypt to buy grain. But Jacob wouldn't let Joseph's younger brother Benjamin go with him, for fear some harm might come to him. So Jacob's sons arrived in Egypt along with others to buy food, for the famine was in Canaan as well. Now, why do you suppose that Jacob sent all 10 of his sons rather than just one? Why do you think he did that? Why not just send one son down there? Why did he send 10 of them? Well, 2 reasons. First of all, there's safety in numbers. You see, it's about 250 miles from Hebron to the city of Memphis in Egypt. And if a person was traveling alone, and especially if he had money in order to buy something, he would be an easy target for bandits. So there was safety in numbers, and that's one of the reasons that all 10 of the sons, with the exception of Benjamin, went down to Egypt. But it's not the main reason. The main reason that all 10 needed to go was because Egypt was rationing the grain. You see, you didn't get to buy all of the grain that you wanted to buy. In that case, you would have had people who wanted to exploit the market. You would have had merchants actually taking huge caravans down there, and they would be buying all of the grain they could because they would be able to take it back to their homeland and sell it for an outlandish amount of money. But Egypt was not allowing that. They were actually rationing how much you could buy. So one person could only buy enough to feed the average family. Now, how do I know that? Because you're reading along, you're probably thinking, now, Pastor, how do you know they were doing that? Well, jump back to verse number 1 and let me show you something interesting. It says, when Jacob heard that grain was available in Egypt, he said to his sons. Now, I want you to underline that word grain. Grain is translated from the Hebrew word sheber, which is not the usual word for grain. The usual word for grain is doggone. You know, like doggone it. But anyways, it's doggone. Now, the reason sheber is used rather than doggone is because sheber refers to rations, grain that is only used in emergency situations, grain that is stored for a special purpose, and that's divvied out in times of extreme need and only in restricted amounts. That's what the Hebrew word sheber actually means. So this grain that was stored up for the famine had to last for 7 years. Joseph knew that. So they weren't allowing people to buy all the grain that they could afford. No, if you went down to Egypt, you were only allowed to buy as much as your family needed. So if he would have sent just one of his sons, then he would have only been able to buy enough for his wife and his children. That's why all 10 of Jacob's sons had to go to Egypt. Now, as you can see, Jacob didn't allow Benjamin to go alone. And I'll be honest with you. As I've read this story in the past, I've always wondered if it was because he always suspected that his 10 sons had something to do with what happened to Joseph. Now, let's be honest. Jacob was a very intelligent man. If you look back in his younger years, the things that he did while he was at the home, the things that he did with Esau, when he went and became a son-in-law to Laban, he's the one that made him filthy rich. He was an extremely intelligent man. He knew the character of his sons. So I've always suspected that he suspected that his 10 sons had something to do with the disappearance of Joseph. So he was scared, I believe, to trust Benjamin with him. Now, I can't prove that, but I can show you why I believe that. Look at verse number 4 again. But Jacob wouldn't let Joseph's younger brother Benjamin go with them. He wouldn't let Benjamin go with them for fear some harm might come to him. Now, wait a minute. You've got 10 grown men going. who were somewhere between the ages of 40 and 46. And these 10 men were more than capable of not only taking care of themselves, but also taking care of their younger brother. Now, how old was Benjamin at this time? We estimated that he was probably 2 years old when Joseph was 17. Now remember, he didn't come before Pharaoh until he was 30. 13 years had passed. And then you've got 7 years of good crops, and then the famine starts, and they're probably in the second year of the famine. So how long are we talking about? 13 and 7 is 20, plus another 2 is 22 years. So how old is Benjamin? If he was a toddler, he's somewhere between the ages of 24 and 26. He's a grown man. Now you've got 10 of your sons going who's somewhere between the ages of 40 and 46. Your youngest son is 24 to 26 years old, and you're afraid to let him go? Why was he afraid? Well, I believe it's because he always suspected that his 10 sons had something to do with Joseph's disappearance, and that's why it says he wouldn't let them go with them. He just didn't trust them. Now, look at verses 6 through 8. Since Joseph was governor of all Egypt and in charge of selling grain to all the people, it was to him that his brothers came. When they arrived, they bowed before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph recognized his brothers instantly, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where are you from?" he demanded. "From the land of Canaan," they replied. "We have come to buy food." Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they didn't recognize him. Now, remember, the grain that was collected during that 7 years of prosperity was actually stored at the city it was collected from. Remember, that was super smart. Joseph didn't just say, we're going to tax them 20% instead of the regular 10%, and then they would come in and take the grain and carry it off to another city. No, they didn't do that. He said each city needs to store its own grain, because that would make the tax go along a lot better to the people. So actually, all of the grain that was stored up for the coming 7-year famine was stored in the cities that it was collected from. So every city in Egypt had its own storehouse of grain. So what do you think the odds were of Joseph's brothers going to the exact city where Joseph was? You ever thought about that? What are the chances if every city in Egypt had its own storehouse of grain that was collected and stored for the 7 years of famine that was coming? What were the odds that they went to the exact town on the same day that Joseph was there? Well, actually, that's a trick question, because they didn't have any choice to which city they were going to. They had to go to the city where Joseph was. So the truthful answer is the odds were very good. And let me explain why. Egypt wasn't vulnerable to many attacks. In fact, if you look at Egypt, and I showed you this last week, they've got desert to the east of them. They've got desert to the west of them. They've got desert to the south of them. In fact, they only thought of their country as the black dirt that surrounded the Nile. It's kind of like this long oasis that goes all the way from Ethiopia all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. And of course, it fans out into this delta. But the only place that Egypt was actually vulnerable to an attack was from the north, from the northeast. But they were vulnerable there. Now, here's what's interesting. In that time period, during a famine, it wasn't unusual. In fact, it was very common for one nation to attack another nation for their food supply. Let's think about it. If their nation was having a famine and there was another nation that wasn't experiencing it, or maybe they had stored up this food and you are starving, if you're a stronger nation, are you going to go and try and buy that grain? No. You're not going to buy that grain. You're going to attack that country and try to take over the grain. So to try and protect themselves, all foreigners could only buy grain from one city. And that city was where Joseph would be, making sure that the foreigners were not spies sent in to gain information. So they actually had to go to the city that Joseph would be in to make sure that the foreigners that were coming in were not spying out their fortifications in order to be able to go back and say, this is the way we need to attack. So Joseph's brothers had to go to the city where Joseph would be, which was most likely Memphis. Now, let me explain a little bit about Memphis and show you where it is. Memphis is about 12 miles south of modern-day Cairo. In fact, let's put that on the screen and let me kind of show you this. I wish I had a better picture of it, but this is the Red Sea down here, and it goes into the Gulf of Aqaba here. It looks kind of like rabbit ears. You see that here. And then it goes up here to the Gulf of what we call Suez, because the Suez Canal goes from this point all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, if you notice as I come down, this is the Sinai Peninsula, and over here is Egypt. And you can see this is where the Nile comes down Egypt, and then it goes to what is known as the Delta. It branches out, and it flows into the Mediterranean Sea. Now, right up here is Cairo. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's some pyramids on this side. Well, what's interesting is those are the pyramids of Giza. Does anyone know who built those pyramids? Khufu. Nice little name. Khufu built those pyramids. He was also known as Cheops. So if you travel to Egypt, you will go to the Cheops, the pyramids of Cheops, or the Cheops pyramids. Now let me ask you a question. When Mary and Joseph had to travel with baby Jesus to Egypt, were the pyramids already there? Did they see the pyramids? Yes. Were the pyramids there during the time of King David? Yes. Were the pyramids there when Joseph was in Egypt? Yes. When Abraham had to go to Egypt, were the pyramids there? Yes. These pyramids were built sometime between 2560 BC and 2480 BC. Now, I bring that up because as we look at that, you'll see these pyramids here, and then Memphis is right here. It's actually on the west side of the Nile, and Cairo today actually is on both sides of the Nile. You'll pass over this huge bridge to go from the east side to the west side of Cairo. But what I want you to understand is Memphis was a very important place. And that's probably where Joseph was, and that's where the 10 brothers would have to go because they were foreigners. Now, of course, because Joseph was the vizier of Egypt, everyone had to bow to him. So when his brothers came before Joseph, they did what everyone did. You had to. You bowed before Joseph. And immediately when they came in, he recognized them, but they didn't recognize him. Look at verses 6 through 8 again. Since Joseph was governor of all Egypt and in charge of selling grain to all the people, it was to him that his brothers came. When they arrived, they bowed before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph recognized his brothers instantly, but he pretended to be a stranger, and he spoke very harshly to them. "Where are you from?" he demanded. "From the land of Canaan," they replied. "We have come to buy food." Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they didn't recognize him. Now, as I told you before, Reuben was only about 6 years older than Joseph. So Joseph and his brothers were very close to the same age. I don't know why, but sometimes we think because he was the 11th child. You remember we were going through all of the children that Jacob had, and Rachel had a really hard time getting pregnant, but finally she got pregnant with Joseph. And so when we look at that and we say, oh, he had all of these other brothers and sisters ahead of him, we have the tendency to think because we live in a monogamous society that there must have been 20, 25 years difference between Reuben and Joseph, but that's not true. As we went through the verses and looked at the details, what we found was Reuben was only about 6 years older, and he was the oldest. He was only about 6 years older than Joseph, which means that all of the brothers were roughly around the same age. Now, knowing that, why in the world did he recognize them, but they didn't recognize him? Well, he was a kid, a baby, when he was sold. No. He was 17 years old. He was a man. He hadn't seen them for 17 years old, and many of his brothers were just a few years older than him, some a few months older than him. So why did he recognize them, but they didn't recognize him? Well, it's because Joseph looked totally different. Not because of his age, but because of the culture. Remember, by this time, he looked like an Egyptian. He was completely shaven like an Egyptian. We're not just talking the beard. Now, you need to understand, when his brothers came down, their hair would have been shoulder length. Wouldn't have been any longer than shoulder length. You know, they show that many times, but it wouldn't have been any longer than shoulder length, but it wouldn't have been short. And they would have had a full beard. They wouldn't have groomed the beard either. The beards would have been way down here. But the Egyptians, because of personal hygiene, all of the men would shave all of the hair on their bodies if you were part of the aristocrats. And of course, Joseph was. So he didn't have a beard. He was clean shaven, even the top of his head. No hair anywhere on his body. He also dressed like an Egyptian. He had an Egyptian name. And he acted like an Egyptian. So they had no idea that they were bowing to Joseph. Look at verses 9 through 11. And he remembered the dreams he had about them many years before. He said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see how vulnerable our land has become." "No, my lord," they exclaimed. "Your servants have simply come to buy food. We are all brothers, members of the same family. We are honest men, sir. We are not spies." Now, as I said, as soon as he saw them, he recognized them. And when they bowed down to him, he remembered the dream that he had in Canaan about their chiefs. Remember, the chiefs represented every one of them, all of the brothers, and their chiefs bowed down to his. And of course, what really got him in trouble is when he had the other dream, and not only his brothers, but also his mother and his father were bowing down. But as soon as his brothers came in, he recognized them, and they bowed down. Immediately, he remembered the dream that he'd had when he was in Canaan. And I'm sure it bolstered his faith. And all of those things that had happened in Canaan came flooding back into his remembrance. Remember in last chapter what he named his children? One of the names that he named his children was that I forget the bitterness, the suffering that I've had. Things were so good, he had now forgotten all those things. But when he sees his brothers and he sees them bowing down, his mind goes all the way back. He remembers the dream, and all of those memories start flooding in. Now, because they don't recognize him, he's going to be able to test them without them knowing it. You see, Joseph wants to know whether or not they've changed over the last 22 years or whether they've stayed the same. Do they have the same character they had 22 years ago when they persecuted him, threw him into the pit, were going to leave him to die, and then decided to sell him into slavery? Or had they changed? And because they didn't recognize him, he had the perfect opportunity to do that. He had the opportunity to put them to the test without them even knowing it. Now, what he was going to do is exactly what God does to us many times. Actually, what Joseph did was he conducted what is known as the mirror test. How many of you know what the mirror test is? Anyone ever heard that term? Been reading along in a commentary and heard mirror test? Okay, let me explain what the mirror test is. Whenever we fail in a certain situation, God waits a while, and then he puts us in a similar situation to see if we've learned anything from that experience or if we're going to do the very same thing again. That's called the mirror test, because the situation that God puts us in mirrors the previous situation in which we failed. And that's why scholars refer to it as the mirror test. So, Joseph is going to put his brothers in a situation that mirrors the situation that they were in 22 years ago to see if they learned from that experience or if they're going to do the very same thing they did back then. You see, that's the only way to know if they've really changed or if they're the same way they used to be 22 years ago. And if they've changed, Joseph will know he can bless them. If they haven't changed, he will meet their needs, but he won't bless them the way that he really wants to bless them. As I said, God does the very same thing to us. When we fail in a situation sometime later, God gives us the mirror test. He puts us in a similar situation that mirrors the one in which we failed. And the whole purpose of that is to see if we learned anything from the previous experience or if we're going to do the very same thing. Now, how many of you like Joyce Meyer? I like Joyce Meyer. I like to listen to Joyce Meyer. She says some very practical things, and probably one of the reasons I like Joyce Meyer is because she tells it like it is, and that's kind of my style. Have you ever noticed that? You know, I have the motivational gift of prophecy. That's different than the spiritual gift of prophecy, but in the motivational gift of prophecy, things are black or white. And I have the tendency to just look at things black and white. And when I'm teaching, sometimes I'll go, well, if you don't like that, there's the door. You ever heard me say that? Okay, I'm very blunt. So I like teachers who are very blunt, so I like Joyce Meyer. Now, if you're familiar with Joyce Meyer, you know that she likes to use a certain analogy. In fact, she uses it all the time. It's the analogy of going around the mountain. How many of you have ever heard her use the analogy of going around the mountain? Oh, you're kidding, that's all? How many of you don't ever listen to Joyce Meyer? Okay. How many of you listen to her and you just didn't want to raise your hand, but you've heard the analogy of going around the mountain? Okay, good. Well, when she talks about going around the mountain, she's actually talking about the mirror test. She's just not using the scholarly term, the one that theologian uses. She's actually using something that we could relate to. But what she's saying is, you don't move on until you pass the test. So you go around the mountain and God puts this mirror test here. He puts you in a similar situation that you failed previously. And if you fail that test, you got to go all the way around the mountain again, and then you get there, and God puts you in the same type of situation. It's not completely the same. It's a little bit different, but it's the same type of situation. And you keep going around the mountain until you finally pass the test. Now, when you pass the test, God can bless you, and you don't have to keep going around the mountain. You can move on. You can stop at that point going through that very same test. But what Joyce is talking about is what scholars refer to as the mirror test. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of what Joseph was doing to his brothers because I'm going to save that for next week. When we get into chapter 43, I'm going to show you that everything that he did to them had a purpose to it. And the reason I want to show you that, and the reason I'm bringing it up now, is because many of you are reading this story, and when you come to what he did, you go, ooh, Joseph had a little bitterness in him, didn't he? Ooh, he wanted to get vindictive. He wanted some payback. And so we read the story in that way, but what we don't understand is that Joseph wasn't trying to get revenge. He wasn't being vindictive. He just wanted to know. I take that back. He needed to know if his brothers had changed in the last 22 years or if they were the same. And the only way to find out was to perform the mirror test, to put them in a similar situation to the one they were in 22 years ago, to see if they would do the very same thing they did back then or if they would react differently today. So the first thing that Joseph does is he steps back and he accuses them of being a spy. You are spies. Now here's what's interesting. He accuses them of being spies just as they had accused him of being a spy and reporting back to his father. And of course they denied it. And I want you to notice what they said to Joseph. Look at the last part of verse 11. We are all brothers, members of the same family. We are honest men, sir. We are not spies. Now I want you to underline in your Bible, we are honest men. That's what they tell Joseph. They said the very same thing that Joseph had said to them 22 years ago. He wasn't spying on them. He was just doing what his father had told him to do. He was being honest and upfront with them, and he was being honest with his father. Now, look at verses 12 through 13. No, he said to them, you have come to see whether our land is unprotected or not. But they replied, your servants were 12 brothers, the son of one man. In other words, we're not soldiers. We're not born of these different. We might look different, but it's because we have different mothers. We're all brothers. We are the sons of one man who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more. Let me say it again. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more. Now let me say it one more time, but only the last. And one is no more. Now Joseph knows the story they've been telling everyone about him. He is no more. In other words, they've been telling everyone that he had died. And that was a lie. So all of these years they had been covering up what they had done to him, and they were telling everyone that he was dead. Now remember, they allowed their father to believe that he'd been killed. And then because he believed that, they were telling everyone, and our youngest brother, until Benjamin came along. Our youngest brother besides Benjamin is no more. In other words, he's dead. So, they're barely into this test, and already they're failing. Why? They claim to be honest men, but they've never come clean about what they've done. So the test must continue. It could have stopped right there if they told the truth, but they didn't. So the test must continue. They claimed to be honest men, but they weren't honest. They had never come clean. Now, here's what's interesting. I truly believe this. If you know what he's doing and you understand the mirror test, you realize that had they come clean, the test would have immediately stopped. If they would have said, we're from Canaan, and the youngest, there's 12 of us, is still with Father, and one, well, we did something that we're not proud of. We're kind of ashamed, but he's no longer with us. I can guarantee you at that point, Joseph would have said, don't worry, it's me. Look at me. I don't have the hair. I don't have the beard. I look like an Egyptian, but I'm your brother. And the test would have stopped. But you know, they claimed to be honest men. They sold him into slavery. They lied to their father, and they've covered up this sin for 22 years, and they're still not willing to come clean about it. So, Joseph has no choice but to continue on with the test. Look at verses 14 through 17. Joseph said to them, it is just as I told you, you are spies, and this is how you will be tested. It's a test. Not the type of test that they thought it was, but it was a test. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of your number to get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison so that your words may be tested to see if you are telling the truth. If you are not, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies. And he put them all in custody for 3 days. So Joseph puts them in a pit just as they had done to him. People, everything is the same except the roles are reversed. Now, they're the ones that are in prison for something they were innocent of. And they sat in prison for 3 days, scared to death. Because if he declares that they're spies, what's the punishment? What did they do back then? You're dead. So for 3 days, they're scared to death. And they're in prison for something they're innocent of. The roles are now reversed. Look at verses 18 through 20. On the 3rd day, Joseph said to them, do this and you will live, for I fear God. In other words, I am a godly man. It's interesting that he uses the singular for God, because the Egyptians believed in gods, plural, not him. He's letting his brothers know, okay, I'm a monotheistic person. I believe in one God. If you are honest men, now he's telling them right up front, I want you to understand this. He's being honest. You claim to be honest. He doesn't know that he already knows they've lied. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison while the rest of you go and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me so that your words may be verified and that you may not die. This they proceeded to do. Now, let me ask you something. What changed Joseph's mind? If you remember, he originally said that only one of them would be released and able to go back to get their brother, and the rest of them will stay in prison. Look at verse number 16 again. Remember that? He said, send one of your number to get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison. and he puts him in prison. But 3 days later, he changes his mind. 3 days later, he said, only one of you will have to stay in prison, and the rest should go home to get their brother. So what changed Joseph's mind? Why did he change from saying, you're all going to be in prison except one? I'm going to let one of you go back, get your brother, and come back and rescue the other 9. We'll see if what you're saying is the truth. What changed his mind in 3 days? He said, okay, I'll tell you what, we're going to change it. 9 of you can go back and one has to stay in prison. Does anyone know what changed his mind? Well, Joseph changed his mind because of what he overheard them say while they were in prison those 3 days. You see, from a Western civilization perspective, verses 21 through 24 is out of order. In other words, it's not in chronological order. Think about it. In our Western civilization, we always tell the story in chronological order. How many of you know of someone who's not a good storyteller? Oh, I know lots of you are not good storytellers because I got to listen to your stories. But one of the reasons you're not good storytellers is because you get things out of order and you go, oh, I forgot. And you have to keep inserting details because you were getting things out of order. You see, in our Western civilization, we tell stories in chronological order. And if a story is not told in chronological order, it confuses us. But in the Middle East, they don't always do that. They don't always put things in chronological order. That's why most of us have a hard time with the Gospels. We read the Gospels as if this is a story in chronological order. But they were Hebrews and they didn't do that. They will group the miracles together. Or they will come in and say, okay, these are prophecies. And they'll group certain stories together and they'll take it out of order when they do that. That's why most of us have a hard time with the Gospels. Because the Middle East does not do things the way we do it in Western civilization. Now, that's what happened in this section. And this is why most people don't know why Joseph changed his mind. You see, Joseph overheard them talking among themselves, and that is what changed his mind. Look at verses 21 through 24, and I will prove it to you. Speaking among themselves, they said, clearly we're being punished because of what we did to Joseph so long ago. We saw his anguish when he pleaded for his life, but we wouldn't listen. That's why we're in trouble. Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy, Reuben asked? But no, you wouldn't listen. And now we have to answer for his blood. Of course, they didn't know that Joseph understood them, for he had been speaking to them through an interpreter. He had pretended that he didn't understand Hebrew. That's why he was using interpreter. He understood everything they said. They just didn't know he did. Now he turned away from them and he began to weep. He didn't want them to see he was crying. When he regained his composure, he spoke to them again. Notice the word again. In other words, he changed his mind. The first time he told them, 9 of you will stay in prison. 1 will be released to bring your brother back. But when he overheard this, he spoke to them again. He changed his mind, and the second time he said, no, I'll tell you what. Only 1 of you will stay in prison, and the rest of the 9 will get to go back. Now notice what it says on. Then, after he changed his mind, then he chose Simeon from among them and had him tied up right before their eyes. So as you can see, this section explains why Joseph changed his mind. They were talking in front of him because they thought he couldn't understand them, and he actually heard that they were remorseful. He heard that this guilt had weighed on them for 22 years, and they were sorry for what they had done. And he found out something else very interesting. He found out that Reuben had actually tried to stop it. Now that's very important because in that culture, if you were going to keep one, which one would you keep? The oldest, Reuben. Why? Because he would be the most important to the family. Remember, his position gives him the birthright unless he proves himself to be unworthy of it. And so you always kept the eldest because he was going to be the future leader. He was being primed for that position. But he doesn't do that. He takes Simeon, who was the second oldest, and Reuben gets a break because of what Joseph learned by listening to them. Everyone following me? Now, why is Simeon chosen? 2 reasons. Number 1, he's the second oldest. Number two, he has a cruel streak. He was probably the worst to Joseph. Remember, it was Simeon and Levi who went in and killed all the men in Shechem. So Simeon has to say, now look at verses 25 through 28. Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to put each man's silver back in his sack, and to give them provisions for their journey. After this was done for them, they loaded their grain on their donkeys and left. At the place where they stopped for the night, one of them opened his sack to get feed for his donkey, and he saw his silver in the mouth of the sack. My silver has been returned, he said to his brothers. Here it is in my sack. Their hearts sank, and they turned to each other trembling and said, what is this that God has done to us? Man, when they found out that the money had been returned, they were scared to death. Now look at verses 29 through 36. We're moving fast. When the brothers came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, they told him everything that had happened to them. The man who is governor of the land spoke very harshly to us. We talked to the second man in command over all of Egypt. And he accused us of being spies scouting the land. But we said, we are honest men, we are not spies. We are 12 brothers, son of one father. One brother is no longer with us, and the younger is at home with our father in the land of Canaan. Then the man who was governor of the land told us, this is how we'll find out if you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers here with me and take grain for your starving families and go on home. But you must bring your youngest brother back to me. Then I will know you are honest men and not spies. Then I will give you back your brother, and you may trade freely in the land. Now see, Joseph knows they're going to have to come back, because how long is this famine going to last? 7 years. This is probably the second year. He only is rationing out enough for 1 year. He knows they're going to have to come back. As they emptied out their sacks, there in each man's sack was the bag of money he had paid for the grain. The brothers and the father Jacob was terrified when they saw the bags of money. Jacob exclaimed, you are robbing me of my children. Joseph is gone. Simeon is gone. And now you want to take Benjamin too? Everything is going against me. How many of you have ever felt like that? I want you to remember that, because Jacob doesn't realize that God is getting ready to do the most supernatural thing for him. He is going to be treated like royalty in a little bit. But at the time, it looks like everything is against me. God, how can you bring this about? Now, Jacob is afraid that if he lets them take Benjamin to Egypt, he's going to lose him too. So he refuses to let them go back to Egypt with Benjamin, at least until the grain runs out. And then he's going to be forced into letting Benjamin go, but that's in chapter 43. Now let's read verses 37 and 38, and that's going to finish this chapter. Then Reuben said to his father, you may kill my 2 sons if I don't bring Benjamin back to you. Reuben is always so dramatic. Remember, he's unstable as water. Here he says, kill my 2 sons. Is Jacob going to do that? No. I'll be responsible for him, and I promise to bring him back. Always wants to be the leader, but really doesn't have what it takes. But Jacob replied, my son will not go down with you. His brother Joseph is dead, and he is all that I have left. If anything should happen to him on your journey, you would send this grieving white-haired man to his grave. So Daddy says no until the grain runs out. Now, next week, we're going to see how the brothers actually pass the mirror test. And you're going to see that Joseph wasn't being mean. He wasn't being vindictive. He was just testing them, which was a very wise thing to do, because he wasn't going to invite them to Egypt if they hadn't changed. He would have met their needs, yes. He would have made sure that they made it through the famine and had everything that they wanted, but he wasn't going to bless them like he did if they hadn't truly changed, and that's next week.